60 million of them once thundered across North America. They shaped rivers, built forests, and fed entire civilizations. Then we erased them. And the moment we did, the land began to die. Slowly, quietly, and completely. This is the story of what happened when one group of scientists decided to bring them back, and why what they discovered in the years that followed should change the way every human being on this planet thinks about nature. To understand what the return of the bison truly means, you first have to understand what the world looked like before they disappeared. Close your eyes for a moment and try to picture it. Not the America of highways and cities and fenced-off ranches. Picture the America that existed thousands of years before any of that. Picture a landscape. So alive, so overwhelming in its scale and energy, that the first European explorers who laid eyes on it genuinely struggled to find words. They wrote home to their families and said the plains looked like a living ocean. A dark, breathing, moving ocean made not of water, but of fur and muscle and hooves that shook the ground for miles in every direction. The bison were not simply animals living on the land. They were the land. They were the single most powerful ecological force on the North American continent. And everything, and I mean everything, was built around them. The grasses grew because of them. The rivers ran cleaner because of them. The soil stayed rich and deep and full of life because of them. Prairie dogs built their towns where bison grazed. Eagles and hawks circled overhead wherever the herds moved. Wolves and bears followed behind, feeding on the stragglers and the weak. Indigenous nations built entire cultures, entire spiritual universes around the rhythms of the bison migration. These animals were not simply a resource. They were the heartbeat of a continent. And then, within the span of a single human lifetime, we silenced that heartbeat almost completely. The slaughter of the American bison is one of the darkest and most consequential ecological crimes in recorded human history. It did not happen slowly or gradually. It happened with terrifying speed and almost mechanical efficiency. In the 1870s, professional hide hunters flooded the plains with high-powered rifles, capable of killing over 100 animals in a single stand without the herd even running. The railroad companies encouraged it. The United States government quietly supported it, understanding that destroying the bison meant destroying the independence of the plains tribes who depended on them. By 1889, just a couple of decades after the slaughter began in earnest, official estimates counted fewer than 1,000 bison left alive on the entire continent. A population of 60 million animals had been reduced to a number you could theoretically fit inside a single large building. The survivors were scattered, traumatized, genetically isolated, and deeply compromised. And the land they left behind was unrecognizable. Without the weight of millions of hooves aerating the soil every season, the ground hardened. Without bison grazing in their characteristic unpredictable patterns, the grasses became monotonous and rigid. Without bison wallows, those shallow depressions the animals carved into the earth by rolling and pawing, the prairie lost the small wetland pockets that had sustained insects, amphibians, and birds for millennia. Without bison dung enriching the soil and feeding the underground networks of bacteria and fungi that kept everything alive, the prairie began to die from the roots up. Nobody noticed immediately. These things take time. But the land remembered the absence of the bison long after the humans had moved on. Decades passed. Cattle replaced bison across the Great Plains. And cattle, for all their economic value, are fundamentally different grazers. Cattle are selective. They find the most nutritious, most tender young grasses and eat them down to the roots over and over, returning to the same spots repeatedly, giving nothing a chance to recover. They compact the soil beneath their hooves rather than aerate it. They graze near water sources and rarely stray far, causing severe localized damage. They do not wallow, they do not migrate, and critically, they did not evolve alongside these grasslands. Every interaction between a native North American grassland and a cow is, ecologically speaking, a mismatch. The grass did not evolve to be grazed that way. The soil did not evolve under that kind of pressure. And the consequences built up over generations of cattle ranching until large stretches of the American plains began exhibiting the early symptoms of desertification. In Texas, these symptoms were particularly severe. The state had once been part of the core range of the southern plains bison, a genetically distinct subspecies that had adapted over thousands of years to the specific conditions of the Texas panhandle. When those bison vanished, the transformation of the Texas grasslands accelerated dangerously. Invasive woody plants, particularly mesquite trees, began spreading across the landscape at dramatic speed. Mesquite is extraordinarily aggressive. Its root systems can reach down 30 feet into the earth, pulling up groundwater that would otherwise feed the surrounding grassland. Where mesquite takes hold, the water table drops, native grasses suffocate, and the land becomes progressively drier and more degraded. Add to that the effects of intensive cattle grazing over many decades, and what you're left with is land that does not look like Texas ever should. Cracked, pale, sparse, prone to dust and erosion, hostile to wildlife, and seemingly beyond recovery. By the late 20th century, many ecologists and conservationists had largely given up on large stretches of the Texas Panhandle. The degradation was simply too advanced, the stressors too many and too entrenched. The soil had lost so much of its microbial life that even if you removed the cattle and planted native seeds, there was no guarantee anything meaningful would grow. The conventional scientific wisdom was that restoring these landscapes would take generations, if it was even possible at all. Most people accepted that. Most people moved on, but not everyone. Because tucked away in the canyon country of the Texas Panhandle, something extraordinary had survived. A small herd of bison, descendants of animals rescued from the Great Slaughter by a ranching couple named Charles and Mary Ann Goodnight in the 1870s, had been quietly living on private ranch land for over a century. When genetic testing was eventually carried out on these animals in the 1990s, the results stopped everyone in their tracks. These were not ordinary plains bison. The DNA told a story that scientists had not dared hope was still possible to tell. These animals carried unique genetic markers not found in any other bison population in North America. They were, in the truest biological sense, the last survivors of the southern plains bison, a subspecies that had evolved in Texas, adapted to Texas, shaped by Texas across thousands of generations, and they had somehow, against every odd, survived. In 1997, the J.A. Ranch donated this irreplaceable herd to the state of Texas. They were moved to Capric Canyons State Park, a rugged stretch of canyon and prairie in the Texas Panhandle, where the high, flat plains of the Llano Estacado collide dramatically with the broken, eroded canyon country below. The park became their new home, and it became, without anyone fully realizing it at the time, the starting point for one of the most important ecological stories in modern American conservation. The early years were not glamorous. The herd was small, fewer than 40 animals at the start. The land inside the park was partially degraded. Managers had to fight invasive mesquite and juniper constantly just to maintain enough grassland to support the animals. They built facilities designed by legendary animal welfare expert Temple Grandin to minimize stress during annual health checks. They carefully tracked the genetics of every individual animal, took blood samples, monitored pregnancies, and managed the breeding program with extraordinary precision. It was painstaking, often exhausting work. But the herd grew. Slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as the animals settled into their environment and began doing what bison have always done best. They began to change the land. It started subtly. Park staff noticed that in areas where the bison were actively grazing, the composition of the plant community was shifting. Certain native grass species that had been absent or extremely rare were beginning to reappear. The soil in heavily grazed zones felt different underfoot, less compacted, more friable, more alive. In the wallows that the bison carved out of the dry Texas earth, small pools of water appeared after rainstorms and persisted longer than anyone expected. Insects that had not been recorded in the park for years began showing up in those wallow zones, and then birds followed the insects. Small mammals followed the birds, and scientists started paying very close attention. What the team at Caprock Canyons were observing with their own eyes was gradually being confirmed and quantified in laboratories and research papers around the world. Because the question of what bison actually do to grassland ecosystems was not just being studied in Texas, it was being studied with remarkable rigor at research sites across the entire Great Plains, and the data coming back was extraordinary. The most significant of these studies, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on Earth, delivered findings that were almost impossible to believe if you had not seen the raw numbers yourself. Researchers compared 3 different conditions across a tall grass prairie ecosystem: land grazed by bison, land grazed by cattle, and land left completely ungrazed. They tracked these plots not for a year or two, but for nearly 3 decades. And what they found redefined what scientists thought possible in grassland restoration. Compared to ungrazed land, the plots where bison had been reintroduced showed an increase in native plant species richness of 103% at the local scale, more than double. And these gains did not plateau after a few years and level off. They continued growing for all 29 years of the study. The bison were not merely maintaining the grassland, they were actively building it, year after year, adding species and complexity and resilience in a way that had not been seen since before the Great Slaughter. And what about the cattle comparison? The cattle plots also showed improvement over ungrazed land because any grazing creates some disturbance and diversity. But cattle produced less than half the biodiversity gains of bison. Not slightly less than half. The difference between what a native grazer does to its native landscape and what a domesticated animal does to that same landscape is not a small, subtle variation. It is a categorical difference. It is the difference between a key and a crowbar. Both can open a door in a manner of speaking, but only one was ever designed for the lock. To understand why bison are so much more effective than cattle, you have to understand how differently they behave. Bison do not graze like cattle. They never have. A bison herd does not settle near a water source and slowly graze the land into degradation. Bison move constantly, unpredictably, over enormous distances in patterns that appear chaotic to human observers, but are in fact the product of millions of years of evolutionary pressure. When a large herd of bison moves through an area, they create intense, concentrated disturbance, hooves churning the soil, heavy bodies pressing into the earth, masses of vegetation consumed in days, and then they leave. They do not come back to that exact spot for months, sometimes years. In their absence, the disturbed ground explodes with regrowth. Seeds buried under compacted soil get pushed to the surface by hoof action. Bare patches of earth created by intense grazing become nurseries for pioneer plant species. The heterogeneity, the patchwork of grazed and ungrazed, disturbed and recovering, creates habitat for an enormous range of species that simply cannot survive in a uniform, monotonous grassland. The wallows are a separate miracle entirely. When a bison rolls and paws at the earth, it creates a shallow depression that, in the right conditions, fills with rainwater and holds it far longer than the surrounding ground. These wallows become microhabitats of astonishing richness. Studies have documented dozens of insect species living exclusively in and around bison wallows. Amphibians use them for breeding, birds use them for bathing and drinking. The soil around a wallow develops a distinct microbial community, rich in bacteria and fungi that are the invisible foundation of a healthy ecosystem. A single bison herd, over the course of years, can create hundreds of these miniature wetland ecosystems scattered across the landscape. The prairie builds its own water infrastructure through the bodies of the bison that walk across it. And then there is the dung. It sounds unglamorous, but the ecological role of bison dung in grassland ecosystems is profound. A single adult bison produces enormous quantities of it, and that dung is a world unto itself. Dung beetles, an entire guild of species, depend on it. These beetles bury the dung, aerating the soil and transporting nutrients deep into the root zone. Fly larvae hatch within it, providing food for birds. The nutrients in the dung feed soil bacteria, which feed soil fungi, which partner with grass roots, to help them draw water and minerals from deep in the earth. The entire underground economy of the grassland runs on bison dung. When bison disappeared, that economy collapsed. When they came back, it slowly, painstakingly began to rebuild. This cascade of ecological effects, soil aeration, seed disturbance, wallow creation, nutrient cycling, vegetation heterogeneity, is what ecologists mean when they call bison a keystone species. A keystone is the central stone in an arch. Remove it, and the whole structure falls. Put it back, and everything holds. The bison is the keystone of the North American grassland. Every other species in that ecosystem, from the prairie dog to the burrowing owl to the black-footed ferret to the meadowlark singing at dawn, is in some way dependent on what the bison does to the land. And when the bison was removed, the arch collapsed. Slowly, quietly, over generations, the whole extraordinary structure came apart. Back in Texas, the proof was accumulating on the ground. The Keprok Canyons herd grew from those initial few dozen animals to over 150. The park expanded the land available to the bison, giving them more room to move and graze in their natural patterns. Researchers monitored the vegetation changes with increasing excitement. Native grass species were returning. Invasive plants were retreating in bison-grazed zones. Soil samples showed increasing organic matter and microbial diversity. Satellite imagery of the park, compared with imagery from surrounding ranchland, showed clear and measurable differences in vegetation cover and density. The bison were doing exactly what the science predicted. They were rebuilding their home. The story was not only about ecology, because the bison at Keprok Canyons are not just any bison. They carry genetics that no other herd on Earth possesses. The implications of that are staggering. If this herd had been lost, if the Goodnights had not intervened in the 1870s, if the J.A. Ranch had not preserved them, if Texas Parks and Wildlife had not acted when they did, that genetic lineage would be gone forever. No amount of money, technology, or political will can recreate a genetic heritage once it is lost. The fact that these animals exist, that they are breeding, that their population is growing, is a conservation miracle of the first order. But even as the success at Keprok Canyons became clear, ecologists and conservationists were wrestling with a painful truth. A herd of 150 animals on 15,000 acres of state park, however genetically precious, is not ecological restoration in any meaningful sense. The southern plains once stretched across hundreds of millions of acres. The bison that shaped those plains once numbered in the tens of millions. A small managed herd inside a fenced park is essentially a living museum exhibit. It is conservation in the narrow sense, keeping the species alive, protecting the genetics, But it is not rewilding. To do that, you need scale. You need hundreds of thousands of acres. You need thousands of animals. You need the freedom for the herd to move across the landscape in ways that approximate what they once did naturally. And that is exactly where the conversation in Texas, and across the entire Great Plains, is now urgently heading. The Great Plains Restoration Council, working alongside Texas Parks and Wildlife, has been developing plans for a landscape-scale southern Great Plains conservation and recreation area. The vision is ambitious, almost to the point of being breathtaking. The goal is to establish a second herd from the Capric Canyons animals on the vast shortgrass prairie of the Llano Estacado, the high flat tableland that stretches across the Texas Panhandle into New Mexico. This is the land where the southern plains bison once roamed in their greatest numbers. It is the land these animals evolved on. And it is the land that, with their return, could once again become one of the most ecologically rich and productive landscapes in North America. The federal government is moving in the same direction. The United States Department of the Interior has committed over $25 million to bison restoration efforts across the country. A formal secretary's order has been issued, committing to restoring wild and healthy bison populations using both the best available science and the indigenous. Knowledge that native nations have carried for centuries, knowledge about bison behavior, migration, ecology, and land management that no university program can replicate or replace. The Interior Department currently manages 11,000 bison in herds across 4.6 million acres of public lands in 12 states. That number, while significant, represents a fraction of what once existed and a fraction of what the science says these landscapes need. The indigenous dimension of bison restoration cannot be overstated. For the tribal nations of the Great Plains, the return of the bison is not simply an ecological project. It is a cultural and spiritual homecoming of profound importance. The Texas Tribal Buffalo Project, working with the Lipan Apache and other indigenous communities, recently secured land specifically to restore the ecological and cultural connection between Texas indigenous peoples and the animal they call Ayane, which the Lipan Apache do not consider merely an animal, but a relative. This kind of indigenous-led conservation, grounded in relationships with the land that go back thousands of years, is increasingly recognized as not just culturally important, but scientifically essential. Indigenous communities have been observing, living with, and managing these landscapes for millennia. Their knowledge of what the land looked like before European settlement, of how bison behaved across different seasons and conditions, of which plants and animals flourish in a healthy prairie ecosystem, is irreplaceable, and it is finally being taken seriously by the institutions that once dismissed it entirely. Meanwhile, the science keeps arriving. Studies from across the Great Plains consistently confirm that bison restoration is one of the most powerful ecological interventions available to us. The carbon implications alone are staggering. Healthy grasslands are among the most effective carbon sinks on the planet. A mature, biologically diverse prairie stores enormous quantities of carbon in its deep root systems and rich microbial soil communities. When grasslands degrade, that carbon is released. When they recover, it is recaptured. Bison, by driving the recovery of degraded grasslands, are driving the sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. Restoring even 10% of the Great Plains to functioning bison-grazed grassland could pull billions of tons of carbon out of the air and lock it back into the earth. This is not a marginal benefit. This is climate-scale intervention, delivered not through technology or engineering, but through the natural behavior of an animal that has been performing this function for hundreds of thousands of years. The water implications are equally significant. Functioning grasslands act like enormous sponges. When rain falls on a healthy, bison-grazed prairie, the water is absorbed slowly and steadily into the deep root network and soil structure. It percolates down through the soil profile, recharging underground aquifers. It is released slowly back into streams throughout the dry season, maintaining water flows and supporting aquatic ecosystems. When that grassland is degraded, when soil is compacted and plant diversity is low and root systems are shallow, rainwater cannot penetrate. It runs off the surface, carrying topsoil with it, flooding streams in wet periods, and leaving them dry in droughts. The Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies much of the Great Plains and provides drinking water for millions across 8 states, is being depleted at alarming rates. Restoring grassland health through bison reintroduction would meaningfully help recharge it. The economics of bison restoration, when you factor in water services alone, become extraordinarily compelling. And yet, the obstacles are real. Ranching interests across the Great Plains have historically opposed large-scale bison restoration, fearing competition for grazing land, potential disease transmission between bison and cattle, and the complications of managing wild animals that do not respect property boundaries. These concerns are not without basis, and working through them requires careful, patient engagement. The future of bison restoration in Texas will not be achieved by ignoring the people who live and work on this land. It will be achieved by bringing them into the story, demonstrating the economic value of restored grasslands, and showing that the return of this animal does not have to mean the end of rural livelihoods. The most promising examples are already underway. Regenerative ranching operations across the plains are experimenting with bison alongside cattle, using managed rotational grazing that mimics the movement patterns of wild herds. Early results are encouraging. Land managed this way for even a few years shows measurable improvements in soil health, water retention, and plant diversity. Ranchers who have made the transition report lower input costs, more resilient operations in drought years, and premium prices for bison meat. Leaner, healthier than beef, and increasingly valued by consumers who care about where their food comes from. The story of the bison is, in the deepest sense, a story about what we choose to value. For most of recorded American history, we valued the bison for what we could take: the hide, the tongue, the bones ground into fertilizer. When we had taken everything, we discarded what remained. We discarded the animal, and we discarded the land, and we discarded the futures of the people who had lived alongside both for thousands of years. We replaced everything with something that served our short-term economic interests and assumed the bill would never come due. The bill is coming due now. It is coming due in depleted aquifers and degraded soils and grassland bird populations that have collapsed dramatically over the last 50 years. It is coming due in the loss of pollinators, the spread of invasive species, and the slow creep of desertification across landscapes that were once among the most productive on the planet. And it is coming due in the cultural impoverishment of a continent that tore out its own ecological heart and has spent generations trying to fill the void. But here is what makes this story different from so many environmental stories. Here is what makes it genuinely, powerfully hopeful. The solution already exists. It has always existed. It is standing in a canyon in the Texas Panhandle, 2,000 pounds of muscle and fur and ancient genetic memory, grazing the same ground its ancestors grazed 10,000 years ago. The bison did not forget what to do. The land did not forget what it needed. The relationship between this animal and this landscape is written so deeply into the biology of both that it could not be erased by even a century of destruction. Given even a modest chance, given even a fraction of the space and the protection it requires, the partnership between bison and grassland reasserts itself with breathtaking speed and power. The scientists who study this are not given to hyperbole. These are careful, precise, data-driven people who spend their careers measuring things in small plots over long time periods and writing papers full of cautious language about statistical significance and confidence intervals. When these scientists say that bison reintroduction is producing some of the largest recorded increases in species richness ever documented in grassland ecosystems globally, you should understand the full weight of that statement. They are not saying it lightly. They are saying it because the numbers demand it. Because 29 years of data from some of the most rigorously monitored grassland research sites on the planet leave no room for doubt. The bison work. The bison have always worked, and the grasslands, given the chance, will come back. The question is not whether we have the knowledge to restore the Great Plains. We have the knowledge. The question is not whether we have the scientific evidence that bison restoration is effective. We have the evidence, and it is overwhelming. The only question that actually matters at this point is whether we have the will. Whether we can look at a landscape broken for 150 years and choose to believe it is not too late. Whether we can look at an animal that came within a few hundred individuals of total extinction and choose to see in its survival not a footnote to a tragedy, but the opening line of a new chapter. Whether we can be the generation that does not just talk about what was lost, but actually begins the long and necessary work of bringing it back. Somewhere in the canyon country of the Texas Panhandle, a southern plains bison, one of fewer than 200 animals carrying a genetic heritage that exists nowhere else on Earth, is doing exactly what its ancestors have done for thousands of years. It is moving across the grassland. It is disturbing the soil with its hooves. It is creating a wallow where rainwater will collect and life will gather. It is grazing in its unpredictable, wandering, ecosystem-building way. It does not know it is among the last of its kind. It does not know that scientists are watching with instruments and notebooks and satellite imagery, trying to learn from it everything that a century of destruction tried to erase. It is just doing what it does, what it has always done. What if we choose wisely and act boldly, it will do again across hundreds of millions of acres of a continent that has been waiting, patiently and quietly, for it to come home. The land remembers the bison, and the bison remember the land. The only ones who have some catching up to do are us.